Hey, Mike. Sorry about that.
Hey, I didn't know what was going on.
I know we had some issues on the back end, but we are back. And I see Jody's here. Nope. Give me 1 second. Promoted to panelist. And now we just need Bob, and we'll be all set.
Excellent.
All right. So let's try that again. Hey, Bob, let's try that again. Sorry about that. So just go ahead and share your screen.
It still says host disabled screen sharing.
Not anymore. There you go.
I'll try it again. There we go.
All right.
Let's see here. There we go. Can you still hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Yes.
Okay. Let's see here. All right. Do you want me to just run through some slides real quick, make sure everything's working?
Yeah, go ahead and share it, make sure we can see it, and just advance through.
Just want to get to a video real quick, make sure those are working.
Mm-hmm. Did you share your screen?
I did. Can you not see it?
No.
No. Okay, well, let me try this again.
And to Howard's question, no, you you didn't crash the party. This is our first time using the webinar function, so we're still working it out. So just bear with us as we get things set up.
Okay, can you still see?
Yep.
Green, I can see you now as well as. Okay, you've got movement, everything working okay?
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Looks good.
All right.
All right. So people are coming in now. So let's officially start at 6:35. Let's officially start at 6:35 to let everyone come in. For now, panelists, put yourself on mute. Participants, let us know where you're joining in from today in the chat box, and then we'll start in 5 minutes. Welcome again, everybody. We'll get started in 3 minutes. We'll get started in 1 minute. All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Kendra, and I'm the Public Programs Manager at the New York Transit Museum. This is a program in a new series called Transit After Hours. But before I do my official welcome, I want to hand it over to our museum director, Conchetta Bensavanga, who was a panelist. I don't know where she went. She wanted to say hi to everybody. There she is. Let me make her a panelist again. So give me 1 second. No, not Christina. No. Give me 1 second. Okay. There we go. Okay, so give me 1 second. So like I said, this is the first program in our new series called Transit After Hours, which is a series of conversations, presentations, workshops, and performances inspired by Transit Museum's exhibitions and collections. So this evening, we're joined by Mike Zacchea, Bob Martore, and Jody Shapiro, who will be discussing the MTA's Artificial Reefing Program. So I believe, Conchetta, if you can unmute yourself, you go ahead and say hello.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. I very rarely do this. Usually I'm sort of lurking quietly on our digital discussions, but I just wanted to stop by and say that I am so excited for this talk, and I'm so happy that we did it. We made it. For those of you that don't know, this was predicated on an incredible show that we did about reefing, in 2019. And we were meant to have an in-person discussion last spring, and that didn't happen. But by golly, we're doing it now. And so to have Bob Martore, and of course to have truly the legendary Mike Zacchea with us this evening is just, it's incredible. And so I know I've been talking about this talk for months. I'm really looking forward to the discussion. And I hope where I summer off of the coast of Long Island, a town called Ocean Beach, which is on Fire Island, there's been a lot of talk and concern about artificial reefing. And so that's the second thing I never do. I jumped into that conversation and invited some of my summer friends to try and join this conversation tonight. So hopefully there's some folks from Fire Island and Ocean Beach that can learn a thing or two about the reefing that's going on off the coast of Fire Island right now. But just wanted to sort of say tip of the hat to the whole team for persevering, putting this together. And I'm really, really looking forward to this conversation. So with that, I will go back to being a silent participant. Thank you so much, Kendra. And thank you, Jody. And that's it for me.
Great. Thank you, Conchetta, for joining us this evening. Okay, so before I introduce our panelist and moderator, I'd like to add that if you'd like to use closed captions and you're on a computer, you can click the CC button at the bottom of your screen and select Show Subtitle. And if you're on a phone or tablet, you can turn on captioning by clicking More than Meeting Settings. Additionally, we invite you to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to ask questions throughout the panel. Okay, and now introductions. Okay, Mike Zacchea is the former Assistant Chief Officer, Asset Recovery in charge of providing cost-effective, environmentally responsible, disposable, or recycling of all NYC Transit's unwanted material. The Asset Recovery Group, formed in 1996 under Mike's guidance, was established to provide for the central management of all of Transit's material disposal and recycling functions. Under his leadership, Transit's Asset Recovery Group was cited by the Federal Transit Administration as a model material disposal operation for all rail organizations in the United States. Mr. Zacchea retired from NYC Transit in 2015, works actively as a volunteer with the Disabled American Veterans of America, has an MBA from St. John's University, and served in the US Marine Corps as an officer and Vietnam veteran. Bob Martore has been a marine biologist for over 35 years with the South Carolina Department of Natural Resources. After receiving his master's degree in marine science, he began working in environmental research at the South Carolina Marine Resources Research Institute in Charleston. In 1995, he moved to the field of fisheries management, and in 2000 became program manager of the South Carolina Marine Artificial Reef Program. Bob is a principal investigator and chief scientist for all artificial reef-related research for the Marine Resources Division of SCDNR. He was responsible for the establishment of DNR's research, reefs, and the nation's first ever artificial reef marine protected area, or MTA. And now our moderator, Jody Shapiro. A lifelong New Yorker, Jody has worked at the Transit Museum since May of 2014. Prior to becoming associate curator, she worked in the museum's archive with all the cool photos. She's curated shows about the 2nd Avenue subway, the IRT Flushing line, the Redbird fleet of subway cars, and the Pullis brothers. Before she joined the Transit Museum family, Jody had many jobs. She was a data wrangler, record label stooge, graphic designer, investigative journalist. The most significant of these was working as an archivist for several artist estates, including a number of world-renowned photographers. She holds a master's in library science, has way too many cameras, and fears her enormous LP record collection will be the death of her. So before we get started, a quick overview about this evening's program. After both Mike and Bob present, Jody will then moderate a panel discussion, and then we'll open it up to Q&A from you all. So another reminder to use the Q&A function to submit questions. And now, if Bob can click to the next slide, I'll hand it to Jody to tell us more about the museum and to start the program.
Excellent. Hello, everybody. I'm going to read this slide, which tells you a little bit about the Transit Museum. We were opened in 1976 as part of the bicentennial as the New York Transit Exhibition. We became the New York Transit Museum in the 1980s. Physically, we are located in a decommissioned IND, that's independent subway station in downtown Brooklyn. We also have a gallery and shop in Grand Central Terminal. We have programs for all ages, and now in the pandemic in all locations. And we usually serve over 500,000 visitors a year. Maybe that's more than that with this virtual programming. I hope so. So when we are allowed to see each other in person again, please come and visit us. And now I'm going to turn it over to Bob.
Okay. There we go. Actually, Mike is going to lead off and begin by telling you a little bit about the subway car program from the New York City Transit perspective. Mike, you want to take it away? Unmute yourself, Mike.
Okay, can you hear me now?
There you go.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Jody, and thank you, Kendra. I'm really going to enjoy this evening's conversation. To start with, New York Transit's first artificial reef project began in 1999 when the Transit Authority decided to retire an entire fleet of subway cars rather than adhering to its normal custom of retiring cars as they became obsolete or too expensive to repair. Basically, we went from scrapping cars in groups of 5 to 20 to this enormous fleet of 1,300 Redbird cars. And This was problematic on many fronts. The first problem was expense. It was tremendously expensive to dispose of subway cars at that time, because these cars, the Redbird cars, having been manufactured in the 60s, were manufactured with heavy use of asbestos-containing materials in the insulation and the mastic that held the floors down, and in between the walls of the subway cars as spark-inhibiting material. To abate this, it would have to be painstakingly scraped from every surface, transported to a licensed asbestos landfill, and disposed of that way. We began to look for alternative ways to dispose or reuse the cars. And I came upon the idea of using them as artificial reef material. My first thought was that we could use them to prevent erosion on the east end of Long Island. But when in discussions with the Army Corps of Engineers, they advised that because of the tremendous surf forces, these cars would roll, and they would break up, and they wouldn't be effective as materials used to reduce erosion. Their suggestion was using them as artificial reef enhancement materials, which is basically when the journey began. Just a quick recap. This program, we put 1,269 cars in the water between August 2001 and November 2003. Delaware, the first state, took 619, South Carolina, 200, Virginia, 150, Georgia, 50, and New Jersey, 250 cars. Can I have the next slide, please, Bob? This is just a sort of a typical Redbird in appearance, in service at the time. Next slide, please. In order to get this project off the ground, I had to speak with the Army Corps of Engineers, who has the oversight authority for the United States as far as permitting artificial reefs. They were principal in getting it. It was important to get them on board for this. The U.S. EPA was also a very important ally to have, because they were going to help us develop a cleaning protocol to ensure that the cars, once cleaned, were not going to damage the marine environment in any way. So they were very, very instrumental in this project. The National Marine Fisheries Services, as you can see, provides support and guidance to the state programs, and Bob will speak more about them and their role when his turn comes. The U.S. Coast Guard was also involved in our process, because they're responsible for marine navigation and safety over the reefs. Have the next slide, please, Bob. We came up with a plan to clean the cars and remove anything that was environmentally prohibited, anything greases, oils, anything that might float, anything that would trap a diver, a scuba diver in the car, anything that would detach itself from the car and contaminate the ocean bottom. After they were cleaned, the cars were de-trucked. Now, the trucks are the wheel assemblies of subway cars, and they were sold as scrap material for value to a contractor who took them away when the cars were loaded on the reefs to go to the reef sites. After we cleaned the cars, the various state representatives came to our shop at 207th Street in Upper Manhattan and conducted their own inspection. Once the cars were inspected and approved, the cars were loaded onto barges and transported to the various reef sites for discharge or placement on the various reef sites. The next slide, please, Bob. It's not a very good slide. It's not a very clear slide, but this is basically the cleaning protocol that Transit used to prepare the cars for placement on the reef sites. It included removing all doors and windows, removing anything that was fiberglass, anything that could float, anything that was glass, anything that might be a contaminant for the marine environment was removed. Anything that could be cleaned was cleaned, and again, inspected and approved for disposal in the ocean. Next slide. As I said kind of in the beginning, the driving force for this project was really expense. Transit had never disposed of 1,300 or as many cars as were in the Redbird fleet at the time, and the cost was astronomical. By finding an alternate means of disposal, we were able to save or avoid the spending about $22 million. In addition to transit saving the money, we also provided a bonus or a benefit to the marine environment. In addition to that, the presence of artificial reefs stimulate local tourism and recreational fishing and diving, and that has been a boon to the economies of these states that depend on recreational fishing and diving for their economies. In addition to that, the fourth benefit is these states, based on where they got the material from New York City Transit and the use that it was put to, were eligible for federal funds that would also enhance their recreational fishing and scuba diving industries. Next slide. This is what a typical Redbird subway car interior would look like prior to cleaning. This car was probably in service. Next slide. This is what the car looked like during the process of cleaning. As I mentioned earlier, the seat backs and seat bottoms were removed because they're made out of fiberglass material and can float away. The windows in this car are intact, but they would be removed. The stanchion poles that you can see to the lower right, that would stay. It would help support the car body. And the door tracks from the passenger sliding doors would be removed because they contain a lot of grease, and it was easier to just remove them and scrap them than to clean them and leave them in place. Next slide. Here we are at 207th Street where the cars are being staged for loading onto the barge. As you can see in the second and third car there, you can see the windows are removed and the doors are removed. There's someone standing in the doorway there as this locomotive is bringing them to the barge site. In the background, you can see the crane. We have the next shot. Next slide, please. During the process of loading, we re-inspect the cars again to ensure that nothing has been missed. And I guess in this case, something had been missed, and we had a steam cleaner out there to take whatever residual oil or grease was on the gates. The next one. The car is now slung and it's ready to be lifted onto the barge. There is something called a center pin, which is a cylinder that's embedded in the bottom of the subway car that sits in the wheel assembly. That had to be cleaned. It had to be lubricated while the cars were being moved around the yard and staged for loading. So at the last minute, that center pin casting, which is the cup that the center pin sits in, had to be cleaned. So that's what these transit workers are doing at that point. The next slide. Okay, here's the same car being loaded up in the air. And the next one, we should see it being swung over to the barge. Okay, so there's the crane I mentioned earlier before. It's a 500-ton crane, which is more than sufficient to lift the maybe 35,000-pound subway car shell. And here you can see it's being carried over to be dropped on the barge. That looks like the first car for that barge load. Next one, please. This is the iconic Subway Series car. It's one of the ones that wound up in South Carolina. Next one. These are the cars underway. This is what it looked like as the barge was. This looks like some of the cars have already been discharged. When they're at the reef, and I guess Bob will go into this a little bit, There are several kinds of ways that they can be placed on the reef site. Most of the time they use what they call a race course pattern. It's like an oval pattern. The barge just continually makes an oval pattern around a spot that's been selected by the state reef coordinator. And as the barge is circling in this race course pattern, they simply discharge the cars as the barge is underway. Next one, please. Again, here's what it looks like when we're tumbling the cars. They were double stacked. There were two levels of cars. So we had to take the top cars off the top level, drop them onto the deck, and push them off. And you'll see that in the next couple of slides. And Bob, there's one being pushed off. And there's one hitting the water. And that's the end of my part of it. Happy to take questions when we're done. Bob will take it over from here and talk about the second life that these cars will serve. The first life serving passengers in the subway system, and the second life serving the marine community. Bob?
All right, thanks, Mike. Before I get into the specifics about the subway car reefs, I want to just explain a little bit about what an artificial reef is and why we build them, that sort of thing. I think most people have heard the term reef. They're somewhat familiar with it. But most people seem to think of things like the Great Barrier Reef or a tropical coral reef. And that's really not what we have along the east coast of the United States. This is a temperate zone. So our reef system is a little bit different. Really what we have are just a series of rocky outcroppings, ledges or little patch reefs, things like that. Sometimes they're fairly high profile, like you see right here. Sometimes they're just little low relief patches of rock that stick up from the sand. But that rock is really important. In order to have a reef community, it always begins with hard substrate. The organisms that make up the base of the reef, the corals, the sponges, the algae like you see here, they require hard substrate to attach and grow. These organisms can't attach to just sand bottom, so they have to have hard substrate. You see a little bit right here, got some corals and some sponges, a few fish hanging around. A lot of people think fish just swim all around the ocean like it's a big fishbowl, but that's really not the case. Fish like specific habitat. So fish hang around these reef communities. They like having that physical presence in the ocean where they can live. It affords them protection, it affords them food. So this type of rock substrate is really important in the development of a reef community. Here I've got a little video clip. It looks like this is the ocean bottom, but it's really not. You can see as I swim a little further over here, the crack in the rock, you can see that sand underneath, but all the organisms are growing on the rock itself, not on that sand bottom. So a reef community always begins with that hard substrate like you're seeing right here. And this is a really important distinction because most of the continental shelf off the east coast of the United States looks more like this. It's just flat, featureless sand, very barren, very little life. If you imagine standing at the seashore on a beach and you see that sand, imagine that extending out for hundreds of miles with very little life all around it. That's what most of the continental shelf looks like. Our surveys estimate that roughly 80 to 90% of the continental shelf off the east coast of the US looks just like this, just plain flat sand. So while fish prefer real habitat, you have the majority of fish species living around a very small percentage of the ocean bottom. And that's why every coastal state in the country has an artificial reef program, because we can supplement this type of habitat. We can create a community where previously, like you see right here, there was nothing at all. If the only difference between this and a reef community is hard substrate, all we have to do is provide that hard substrate. And we do that in a lot of different ways. Concrete really works well because it's very similar to natural limestone rock that's found offshore. Those ledges that you see, that's for the most part limestone rock, and concrete's very similar. Once we put this concrete in the water, it becomes colonized just like those natural rocky outcroppings and ledges. Organisms grow on the structures themselves, and the fish come and live around those structures. And after a while, you have a very natural reef community. What you're seeing here is all natural growth. There's nothing really artificial. Even though we call them artificial reefs, the reef itself is very natural. It just develops around a man-made structure. So what you see is natural reef, but you can tell it's not a natural rock that it's growing on. And once these sites develop, they function just like natural habitat does. You can see the coral polyps here. You've got juvenile fish that live in amongst that. The little fish are there for protection. They're feeding on the reef. So once you have a developed artificial reef, it functions just like a natural reef site does. That's a video clip I showed earlier with the flat sand bottom. This is what it looks like now after we developed it. We put down those concrete structures like I just showed you, and in a few years' time, you can see the growth on the structures themselves. You can see the very diverse fish communities that come and live around them. So we've now created a very thriving community, very thriving ecosystem in an area of the ocean where previously it was just plain flat sand. Now, we use a lot of different structures to create artificial reefs. Most people are familiar with that. A lot of programs are pretty well known for sinking vessels, ships and things, ships of all sizes. This is a small tugboat right here. We've used larger vessels like this coastal freighter. And ships actually work very well because they're very complex structures. They have a lot of surface area for invertebrate growth. They have a lot of internal spaces where small juvenile fish can hide out. They're seeking refuge to avoid predators like these fish that you see up here. So ships work really well underwater. The subway car program is actually based on a program that the Department of Defense started many years ago. They call it ReefX, where they gave us surplus military vessels, armored vessels, like these armored personnel carriers that you see right here. They went through the same process that Mike showed you with the subway cars, with the cleaning. They removed engines and transmissions, did the steam cleaning, the whole thing. And once these went in the water, they function like the subway cars do. You get water flow through the vessel, so you have growth inside and outside. And they function really well. They're stable on the bottom. The fish come and live around them. And again, over time, this vessel, this personnel carrier that you see right here has been underwater for about 10 years. And now it's a complete ecosystem. You can see all that growth all around it, but what you don't really see in the video is what lives in amongst all that growth. You have little crustaceans like crabs and shrimp. There are worms scuttling all through there. So there's a big food source for a lot of fish. There's refuge for those juvenile fish. So we've got an entire reef community that's developed now around a very unlikely structure, an armored personnel carrier. And that's very similar to how the subway cars have worked. Here's your subway series cars on the barge right here. This was the first load that we got back in 2001, 50 of them at a time on a barge like this, all the way down from New York to South Carolina. Just pushed over. You can see Mike mentioned the pattern for setting these down. You see we mark a spot right there. I won't get into how we pick sites, but we put a spot down. The barge just sort of wanders around and drops these cars over as they go. Here you can see the cleaned car. The doors are gone. The windows are gone. And works out really well. I'll explain that a little more as I show you some scenes underwater. What I'm going to show you now is a series of video clips that demonstrate over time how these reef sites develop. When the cars first went in the water, we actually dove on them the very first day as soon as they were put down. And you can see they look pretty much just like Mike showed you on the rails. Very clean. There's no growth yet on any of the structures. No fish swimming around there yet. These are brand new. This car's probably been in the water about 20 minutes now. That's all. And you can see, just like it looks on land, no seats, no windows, no doors, but no fish or no growth yet either. So this is a brand new car just in the water. Now I'm going to jump ahead 3 months' time. After only 3 months, this is when the fish start showing up. And generally speaking, the first fish that we see are things like this big school. This is little bait fish. These are adult fish, but they're just small fish. What happens, what attracts these, when you have a structure like the subway car, it's basically a big wall on the bottom of the ocean. And currents, as they're coming along, they hit this and push up into the water column. You've probably heard the term upwelling before. Well, these subway cars cause upwelling. The currents hit them and they resuspend organic matter and detritus that's fallen to the bottom, pushes it up into the water column. And that's what these little fish feed on. So they're there swarming all around these subway cars because they're feeding on that upwelling that's caused by the subway car. Now, inside the car itself, you've also got a lot of little fish. Unlike those bait fish, though, these are juveniles. You can see a little bit of growth on the structure itself. It's just starting, but this big school of fish that you see, those are juvenile fish looking for refuge, someplace to hide away to avoid predators. You can see we picked up a rider along the way as we went along. Now, also sticking with this 3-month time frame, again, we've still got juvenile fish here. These that you see down here, these are called Atlantic spadefish. Even though they're a little bigger, these are still juveniles. And again, they're looking for someplace to hide. Some of the cars, you can see there's space underneath them, and they're hiding away under there. They found a little place that they can just hide away either from predators. Sometimes they just want to avoid strong currents, and so they're trying to get out of the currents. So in this time frame, about 3 months, you get small bait fish that are there to feed, and you get juvenile fish that are looking for refuge. Now, you do occasionally get other visitors to the cars. Other things wandering around are just starting to discover them, things like the sea turtle right here. We've actually found that sea turtles like the subway cars quite a bit. We see them very frequently resting on the floors sleeping. Most people don't know sea turtles like to nap a lot. They can spend up to 2 hours at a time just sitting on the floor of a subway car sleeping. All right, I'm going to jump ahead now for 1 year time frame. This car has now been in the water for 1 year. You can see there's a lot more growth on the structure itself. And the fish that we see, this is when we really start getting an idea of whether or not a reef structure will be successful. The fish that you're seeing, these right here are called black sea bass. These are one of the better indicators of a successful structure because we found that once they inhabit a structure, they tend to live there permanently. They set up a habitat, they'll set up territories and defend them. This is another similar type fish. This is called a triggerfish. Same thing. These fish, once they become established, they'll live there permanently. These fish, the triggerfish, will actually go in the sand in between subway cars and dig out little pits in the sand to make little homes. That's where they spawn, lay their eggs, things like that. So in this time frame, again, 1 year, you're starting to see fish that will permanently inhabit these structures. Again, you don't see a lot of diversity right now, but you do see the first permanent residence of these structures right here. So that's always a good sign when we see that. Just like you saw the sea turtles earlier in the 3-month time period, well, after about a year, when you get a lot of, whoops, not too far. There we go. After about a year's time frame, when you have a lot of a good, well-developed communities, you start getting predators, oceanic predators that are coming around looking to feed. So we still get visitors like these dolphins that you see here. These are spotted dolphins. Not sure if you have those up in New York or not, but again, a frequent visitor, they're there just to feed on the fish that live around these structures. All right, now we're going to jump ahead 5 years now. These cars have been in the water. Now we've got a permanent community right here, a very diverse community. You've got the smaller fish that are there to feed, the juveniles that are there for refuge, but now you've got a predator. This is a red snapper. This is a grouper that you see back here. These are fish that would normally inhabit overhangs and caves, things like that, ledges. So this big interior of the subway car, it's like a big cave for these fish. So just like the sea bass, they'll come and live here, not quite as permanently as the sea bass will, but they'll live there seasonally. They'll come during the spring and summer and maybe into the fall. As the water starts to cool down in the winter, they'll move further offshore, but they'll keep coming back year after year because they're there to feed and they're there to spawn. So diversity increases tremendously in this 5-year time frame. You've now got permanent residents, you have transients that will come and go, and you have seasonal residents. So really in this time frame, if you have a good structure that holds its form for that good 5-year time frame, you develop a very well-rounded, very diverse community there. not just inside the cars, outside as well. You still have, you can see, as long as you still have that whole structure, you still have the upwelling, the bait fish. So you get a lot of these pelagic fish. These are more oceanic. They swim around quite a bit, wider range. But whenever you've got, you can see in the background, the big schools of bait fish, that attracts big schools of these predators like these amberjack that you see right here. So again, the cars are working very well, functioning just like any natural habitat would. So again, by this time frame, we can tell, and again, look at the growth on the outside of the car. It's considerable. So just like the natural rocky ledges and outcroppings and things like that, we have a fully functioning ecosystem here around this subway car. One other thing I want to point out in this 5-year time frame, hard corals are very slow developing. They take a long time before they develop, and they grow very slowly. So when we see, you see as we come up top of the car here, we have a couple of different species of corals growing on the top of this. This tells us that this is really full functioning habitat. It's been stable. It's been there long enough for these corals to develop, to get a foothold and really start growing. This really is a really good indication that this is very natural-like habitat. It simulates natural rock extremely well if you can get hard coral growth on an artificial structure. All right, now we're going to jump ahead 12 years after this car has been in the water. Now we've got our full functioning communities. We have a complete ecosystem. Now we start seeing yearly and seasonal variation. Fish that would normally move inshore, offshore during the seasons, they'll come back and forth. Diversity is going to change year to year. Not only the fish life, but on the cars themselves. We see some of the initial growth has been overgrown by other structures. But again, after such a long time in the water, the fish, the invertebrates, they don't have a clue that this is an artificial structure. This is just fully functioning habitat to them. All the animals that we see in any other part of the ocean, we see on these structures as well. So they've held up really well. And again, in this time frame, 12 years, we still had roughly 80 to 90% of these subway cars were upright, complete, holding their shape really well. So we were really pleased with that. Now I'm going to jump ahead again to our most recent video. We took these just this past October. So these cars have been in the water now for almost 20 years. That was our hope, was that they would last that long. And they certainly have. Most of them have. You can see we still have large schools of pelagic fish, large schools of the small bait fish, a lot of different types of fish. These are called rainbow runners. They're similar to a tuna fish. But again, as long as the cars hold their shape and they form that upwelling from the currents hitting them, they're going to bring in all these pelagic fish like you see there. Not only that, but inside we're still seeing snapper and grouper and things like that. They're still utilizing the subway cars just like they do the caves and the ledges and things like that. You can see some snapper down there, a few baitfish hanging around. Now you will notice this car in particular has lost a few side panels and some roof panels, but we've still got roughly 60% of the subway cars we put out after 20 years are still upright and fully functioning. So we consider that a very successful program. Here you can see some of the smaller juveniles that have set up their home in amongst all the growth. Again, as long as there is growth. Now, even when these cars, when the ones who have collapsed and they're just sort of piles of rubble on the bottom, they still function for juvenile habitat. These little fish that swim in amongst all the growth still utilize that. So a subway car doesn't lose its functionality when the walls collapse. It's still working, just in a different manner. So as I said, after 20 years with still such a large percentage of the cars upright, we felt like this was a really successful program. I have just a couple more pictures to show you. Here we've got grouper and snapper living in there. Inside the car, you see these are adult spade fish living in there. So again, it's continued to function for almost 20 years now as permanent habitat for a wide variety of fish. Here in South Carolina, we've got about 50 different reef sites, and each site has a lot of different structures. Like on these, the places where the subway cars are, there might be other things as well, some other ships or vessels. Now, Mike mentioned not using the subway cars close to shore because of the wave action. We put our subway cars on our deepest reef sites. We felt that the deeper water reduces currents, tidal currents, things like that. And we feel like that's helped them last as long as they have. So that's the reason for doing that. And it certainly worked out that way. So again, we feel like this has been a really successful program. Mike mentioned a lot of states are reliant on tourists and things like that. And that's certainly how we feel down here. Down here, recreational fishing is big business, one of our largest industries right here. We don't have all the industry like New York does. We rely quite a bit on tourism, and fishing tourism is a big part of that. Give you an idea of how important this is to the state. When we started doing economic impact surveys to see just how important artificial reefs were to the South Carolina budget. What you've got here are total annual sales generated just by artificial reef usage. Now, this is not just recreational fishing, it's just artificial reef usage. You can see 91, 97, from 17 to 22 million. At the time, we thought that was pretty impressive. Now, here in between, this is where the subway cars went in, 2001 and 2002. And you can see in 2006, that tremendous jump in annual sales, $83 million each year. So by that regard, we consider this an extremely successful program, both economically for the state, environmentally for the fish populations. We've measured how well they're doing producing fish, not just attracting fish from other areas, but actually producing fish. We've measured spawning of many different species. We see them establishing territories, setting up homes and things like that. So we feel that this program has been extremely successful in every regard, and we were really pleased with how everything worked out with the city. That's all I have for now. So I will turn it back over to Jody, I think, and she's going to get going for the rest of it.
Yeah, well, I've got some questions for you, and our audience has some questions for you too. So I have questions for each of you. The first question I have is for Mike. You're talking about how all of these different agencies had to be involved in vetting the cars, basically, and making sure that they were good to go into the ocean. And, you know, getting transit to agree within transit is kind of difficult. So how hard was it for you to get transit to play nice with these environmental agencies?
That's a great question, Jody. If you can imagine trying to convince, a train person that the best thing to do with his train is to put it in the ocean, not very likely. Not something that he'd ever thought about. But in fairness to everybody, the science is what drove this project, what really made the project. Once we had the scientists look at what we were planning to do, and they gave us a thumbs up, it then became an easier task to convince transit that this was the right way to go. There's so much misinformation or so much non-information out there about the Transit Authority and the things that we've done over the years. One of the criticisms we got from outside transit was, look at that, transit's dumping their cars in the ocean when they could be selling them. And the truth of the matter was, because the cars contained asbestos, we're prohibited by law from selling them. Secondarily, even scrapping them was more expensive than the alternative that we found. So we feel good about it. The process of convincing everybody that it was the right thing to do took from like November 1999 until July of 2001. We were that much up to at the end of the race course before we decided to do this. So it was hard work, but it was great. And in the end, there was a senior vice president at Transit in the subway department, Joe Hoffman, who was really the guy that I convinced, and when he was convinced, everybody at Transit was okay with it.
That was the second part of my question, is how hard was it to convince Transit to do this? I mean, you would think because you were offering them a cost savings of millions and millions of dollars that they would have just been like, this is great, let's do it. But I'm surprised that it took that long.
Well, one of the things that I found in the work that I did with Transit and asset recovery was that there's a great concern about what the public will think about what we're doing, no matter what we do. And this was a good example of it. You know, everybody who had a thought about it had an opinion that putting the subway cars in the ocean was the wrong thing. And just to go back to something that Bob said, all of the cars that we put in the water were on ocean reefs, which means they were the minimum of 13 miles, 12 miles offshore. Some as far, I think some of your reefs were 35 offshore, right, Bob?
Correct, yes.
Yeah. And I think the minimum depth of water that we put the cars in was 85 feet. So it left, 60 feet of clearance above the top of the car for navigation. So that was a big concern too. And that's one of the reasons why I believe New York hadn't taken any cars. Some of the reefs that they had were not ocean reefs. They were close inshore, and they wouldn't provide that. I think the Coast Guard requires a minimum of 40 feet of clearance above the top of the obstruction. So, but as I said before, once we had the US EPA on our side, the Army Corps of Engineers, and the National Marine Fisheries Services approving of our plans, the Transit was kind of easy. They went along with it. They were okay with that. But there's a great concern about what the public might think.
Understandable,
Yeah.
The New York City Transit, not just the subway, but the buses and the Metro North and the Long Island Railroad are constantly under enormous amounts of public scrutiny. So, I could see.
I should say one of the things we did before we started the project was we invited about 14 environmental advocacy groups, the Sierra Club, the Hudson River Keepers, the Audubon Society. We invited them to a meeting to talk about what our plan was. They didn't come, but they reserved the right to make a decision, make a judgment about what we did after we did it. But some of them came around, some of them didn't. Some still think we shouldn't be putting those subway cars in the water, even as we see the evidence of how beneficial they are.
Well, I have a question for Bob. Because you were talking about the different types of fish and marine life that come to the reefs. So what was the most surprising sea life development that you saw as a result of these subway cars being put in as artificial reefs?
Well, the variety of fish life that come to live around them. Generally, we have certain fish that live in certain depths all the time. We found that on the subway cars, we got a lot of species that we would normally consider tropical species. Some of the more colorful things that you saw in some of the video clips. Generally, those are found either further south in the tropics or further offshore where it's usually deeper. We got a few different varieties, even as adult fish, not just the juveniles, but we found that on the subway car reefs, we had a tremendous diversity of species that we wouldn't normally see in those depths.
So that makes it more attractive to sport fishermen, which is more money for the states and so on and so on.
Actually increased our diving industry quite a bit. The diving industry, it's sort of, as you come down the coast from New York to Florida, it increases as you go. Nobody has a diving industry like Florida does. But with such a wide variety of fish to see, the tropicals, which folks just find that interesting, seeing all the color and things like that. So it's increased our diving industry quite a bit. Fishermen, they'll come around anything, any place they can catch fish. You'll always see them out there. But divers definitely increased when they found out the variety of life that was on these. When they found out you can actually swim through a subway car, that's really interesting. So it increased diving considerably.
And that comment about swimming through a subway car, one of our attendees wants to know, is it possible for the average person to see these snorkeling and scuba diving? So I guess the answer is yes.
Not snorkeling, well, unless you're a really good free diver.
Free diver, yeah.
But for recreational scuba divers, yes, they are open for recreational scuba diving. Our local dive shops take charters out there all the time. They take people out to swim through the cars.
So another question that has been asked by our audience, which is something that I could have answered, but I'm going to let you guys answer, is will reefing be considered again in the future? It's for both of you.
Well, I'll start. The impetus for the reef projects that we did two. We did the Redbird Reef Project in 2001 to 2003, and we did another project, 2008 to 2010, the stainless steel cars. Interesting note for subway buffs. If all the cars we put in the water were lined up end to end, it would form a line 27 miles long. There are 2,580 cars in the water. So I thought that was an interesting note. So as I began to say, the impetus for reefing was expense driven, because the cost to remediate the asbestos from the cars was prohibitively expensive. It made the cost that we incurred to clean the cars and transport them to the reef sites in the various states much less expensive. Those cars were produced, the Redbirds and some of the stainless steel cars were produced in the 60s through the mid-70s. There was a total ban on asbestos in 1986. So any cars produced after that don't have asbestos in them. So they're more economical to scrap. And since we did this project, the process of scrapping asbestos contaminated vehicles, heavy equipment, has been refined. And we've in fact did a project where we scrapped the subway cars by contracting with a vendor who was able to lawfully remediate the asbestos and lawfully dispose of it and scrap the remaining salvageable material so that transit shared in the profits of that sale. So it's going to be a question of economics, I think, if there's more reefing projects, but I don't think the economics will tip the scales towards reefing.
If they did become available, we would certainly be willing to take some more, and I think most states would. They've just been it's been a successful program. Everybody has enjoyed having subway cars on the reef site. So should it become available, I think people will take them.
I'm glad you mentioned that, Bob. When will transit get some of that 83 million? Just kidding.
I wish.
Yeah.
So, Bob, you showed us some footage of from last October where the cars are starting to break down a little bit. And we did have a question from the audience, which was also my question, is what happens as the cars break down? Like, do you shore them up a little bit? Do you allow them to just collapse and then start over again? Like, what's the protocol for, or is it a sort of a dependent on, like, let's see how the car degrades kind of thing? Well, sorry, that was a lot of questions in one question.
I'll see if I can answer all of it. As they break down and degrade, the cars themselves, we let them break down. As I mentioned, once walls start collapsing, you get a much more low relief pile of rubble, but they still do function. As long as there's any hard surface above the sand, you still get invertebrate growth. You still get those juvenile fish that will live amongst that. So even when they break down, it's not like they lose function completely. They're still functioning just a little bit differently. Now, from a reef management standpoint, we know that we have permanent communities that are living in these areas now. So we don't want to lose those communities by allowing the cars just to collapse completely and everything move away. So we will use other materials. Once these cars start collapsing, we might sink a ship close by, so there's another structure. We might put a few hundred of those concrete cones down there. We want to keep the fish that are there living in that area. So we will put additional material in there, but as far as the breakdown themselves, we will let it eventually break down, and eventually they just become covered in sand, and it's just sand bottom. So it's not like it completely vanishes all the way. Even when it's just beneath a thin layer of sand, you can still get invertebrate growth on it. So we do let the cars collapse once they start, but as I mentioned, from a management standpoint, we will put other things in the area.
And as part of that reef management that you do you transplant, this was another question that we got, transplanting coral, is that something that you guys do? Or do you stay out of that and all you do is just provide the structure for the corals to grow?
We just provide the structure. We did, years ago, again, reef building, I guess you could say it's more of an art than a science. In the beginning, it was all trial and error, what works and what doesn't. And we did some experimentation with transplanting and things like that. And what we found is that we really didn't need to. If you just put the structure out there, it becomes colonized so quickly, you really don't need to go through the trouble of trying to transplant something. So we just put the material down and let nature take its course.
And, I know when I was working on the Redbird show and talking about the Redbird reefs, everybody seemed to be like, everyone that I read quotes from, people that I talked to, everyone was surprised that the Redbirds has lasted as long as they have, because they're not even completely disintegrated now, but the other cars from the other reefing program didn't fare as well because they were, they're made of a different material. They're a different kind of steel. Was that a surprise to either one of you? Or did you kind of know, yeah, two cars enter, the Redbirds are going to stick around,
Let me take the first part of that. We knew that the Redbirds were made out of carbon steel. And we also knew that the second program, the stainless steel cars, was a carbon steel frame to which was attached a stainless steel skin. And the attachment points were subject to galvanic action because of the salinity and the electromagnetic activity of the ocean. So what happened with them is the sides became detached from the frame and they collapsed. And again, as Bob said, they still provided relief off the bottom. It wasn't the 8 foot height of the car, but it was still relief. And so I think we believe that the Redbirds would last a minimum of 25 years. And that we thought the same for the stainless steel cars. And they will, I believe, because the stainless steel won't degrade. As long as it collapses inward, it'll provide relief off the bottom and provide some hard substrate for the marine life to attach. Bob?
We've seen evidence of that. The stainless steel cars, as Mike said, they have collapsed for the most part, but they do provide low relief habitat. Absolutely. We still have growth on them. We still have fish life that live around them. Actually, because they're low piles of rubble, we get things like octopus. They normally live in caves, dig burrows. So we see those underneath piles of stainless steel. So they are functioning, like I said, just a little differently.
And are these reefs made from the subway cars? Are they as good as the concrete ones that you've made, or are they just different?
They're just different. They function differently. Because of the size of the subway cars, they provide much more in the way of a more, I guess you could say, a complete community, because you get that upwelling effect and you have those just tremendous schools of bait fish, small bait fish that bring in the larger schools, amberjack, the dolphin, and things like that. You generally don't see that with the smaller concrete units, but you do see a lot of juveniles that will live inside the concrete units. And of course, the concrete will last longer. I mean, there's no telling how long that'll be functioning down there. So we don't have to replenish that as often as we would with the subway cars. So we feel like they both work well. They just work in different ways.
So I am not a diver, so I don't think I will ever see these firsthand. I have to enjoy your lovely videos. But for either one of you, where is your favorite place to dive with these Redbirds? Have you spent a lot of time amongst them, or fished? Like, where's your favorite place to fish?
Yeah, the subway cars are honestly one of my favorite spots to dive, because you do get to not just sit outside and look at something, but you swim through it. You're in there with the fish swimming around. Being able to swim through something is always a big attraction for almost any diver. So the subway car reefs, and again, because of the depth where we put them, we get a tremendous diversity too that you don't see on the shallower sites. So they are absolutely one of my favorite places to dive.
What about you, Mike? Are you a fisherman?
Not a diver.
I'm not a diver,
but not a diver. No, I fished on the Delaware reefs, and I've yet to fish on the South Carolina reefs.
I always think that the fish that you catch on the subway reefs are like the ones with the attitude, like, get out of my way, other fish. I bet they taste good too. So yes. We have a question from the audience also, which you sort of addressed, but maybe you could be a little bit more detailed about modern day cars and why they are not ideal candidates for reefing.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, the principal driver with the Redbirds was the asbestos-containing materials that were in the car. There's a spray-on, the cementitious kind of an epoxy that's sprayed onto the inside of the outer skin of the subway cars, and it's put there to reduce or impede sparking and arcing from the subway car trucks and from anything that might be on the roadbed. It's also in the raceways for various wiring diagrams in the Redbird cars. So that isn't present anymore in the cars that are produced after 1986, because asbestos is a banned material. No heavy equipment is, they don't allow asbestos to be used in any heavy equipment. In addition to that, the technology in the new cars, and I'm not a car expert, but the technology is much, much different than the technology of the 1964 vintage Redbirds. So that's a lot of plastic, a lot of printed circuitry, stuff that wouldn't necessarily be good to put in the water. So that's what I think is going to inhibit future reefing programs.
It's the sheer amount of cars too. I mean, we're talking the Redbird fleet. Well, it's not just one type of car that was a Redbird either. There's like 9 types of cars that became Redbirds. Right. So that fleet was 2,500 cars that needed to get rid of. Only a couple of them are still around as work cars. There, some of the de-icer cars, which have been getting a lot of work the past couple of weeks here in New York. Some of them are R33s that would have been Redbirds. And so just from a standpoint, going back to what you said in the very beginning, one of the reasons why this was proposed as a solution was because of the sheer amount of metal that had to be taken off the property. So, and you can't scrap all of it. You can't sell it to other people. So this was an ideal solution for that many cars. I don't know if in the future there would even be a fleet that would be large enough to make this worthwhile. I don't work in material recovery, but I mean,
maybe the R46s or R44s, but the technology, the disposal and recycling technology has also improved over the years to the point where it now becomes more economically feasible to do an abate and scrap process.
And you did mention about the trucks, the wheel assemblies being scrapped for money, but what other parts of the cars got scrapped and raised some revenue, or not much, I would imagine?
Well, interestingly enough, I don't have the numbers at hand, but one of the other things we did in asset recovery was we created a website and we sold memorabilia, and we sold Redbird parts as memorabilia, handholds, and what did we do? Storm doors, stanchion poles, storm doors, hand grabs, and there's a couple of items in the operator's compartment.
Oh, the master controllers.
Yes,
also.
master controllers. Yeah. So it wasn't a ton of money, but it didn't bridge the budget gap. But we got value for it. And there's 800 pounds of copper in a traction motor, and the copper values were good at those times. So we made some money on that.
So, I don't know. I'm trying to scroll through to make sure that I got all the questions that people were asking. Yeah, and I'm thinking like that's probably how I got my master controller, was from a car that's at the bottom of the ocean.
We signed an MOU with Gabrielle Schubert, and we transferred material to her for sale in the museum. Yeah.
Oh, here's one question that was asked early that I might have missed. And this is a Bob question. So this person wants to know what data has been collected regarding ecosystem changes since the reefing program began, and who monitors it? I don't know if you can answer that, but
probably not completely. Each state is responsible for monitoring its own artificial reefs, not just the subway cars, but reefs in general. Some states, for example, we here in South Carolina, we do our own monitoring ourselves in a lot of different ways. We keep the video logs are a big part of that, so we can compare things through the years. But we look at fish populations over time, how they change, if they're moving, latitudinally, that sort of thing. Some states will hire like universities and things like that to do their work for them. Some states don't do it at all. So it really varies from state to state. Was there a second part to that question that I?
No, that was the who monitors and there's must be a lot of data that is collected by other people than like real marine biologists who study these amberjack. And I know, sorry, it's like every time I talk to you guys, I have like more and more questions to ask you. Have you seen positive or negative effects in migratory patterns of certain fish? That was something that we talked about the other day, that you noticed some interesting changes.
I don't know if you could call them positive or negative. There are some changes. We do, as I mentioned, we see species that might be, well, the northerly migration, that's sort of happening all over the place anyway. We did see that initially with the subway cars, species that were further south or from further offshore moving in to utilize this habitat. But through the years now, since we put those in, we see just sort of a general northerly migration of almost every species. So that really can't be attributed to the subway cars themselves or really any reef material. That's just a factor of changing environmental conditions, warmer temperatures, that sort of thing. So again, that's something we see generally speaking. We can't really attribute that to any specific factor like subway cars or artificial reefs.
You had mentioned something about tropical fish that you had seen that were strangers.
Yes, we do. If we have nice habitat, an area, whether it's subway cars, concrete, whatever it may be, if it's been developing for a number of years and has a good diversity, if it has good invertebrate growth on it, then we see tropicals that we might not normally see in that water depth inhabiting those, because the structure is a little bit different. Now, normally the live bottom areas, those rocky outcroppings and ledges that I showed, those are generally found in deeper water. So that type of habitat, that's where you see those tropical species. Now, as we create a reef a little closer to shore, once it develops and has a lot of good growth, years and years of growth on that, we'll see some of those species come in and inhabit those. So their range is increasing a little bit. It's not necessarily, moving, but increasing overall.
You're giving them room to grow.
Exactly.
And there's one more question that hasn't been asked, and it's about getting the cars to the bottom of the ocean. How do you make sure they land right side up?
Well, they're all the cars are bottom heavy. The most significant structural part of the car is the platform. So,
and we did find after examining them that almost every one landed upright. The only time there was any ever problem is if they hit another car on the way down, they might have tipped sideways. But almost every car landed upright.
No matter what orientation they were in when they went into the water, they landed on the bottom.
Like a cat that always lands on its feet.
Yes, yes.
So I see Kendra turned her video on, so that must mean it's almost time for us to stop.
Yes, yes. It's officially time for us to stop. And I hope my camera is working. My computer has low bandwidth, but hope you can hear me. Thank you to Mike, Bob, and Jody for a wonderful presentation. And thank you all for joining us this evening for our very first Transit After Hours program. Our next one will be March 4th. We'll be in conversation with New York Nico, a popular Instagrammer, about the new PSAs on the subways and the buses around the city. So for more information about that and other programs, visit us at nytransitmuseum.org. Until next time, see you then.
Thanks for coming, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.